as they're making their way out of the fort, the story goes that Sumter's men looked into the wagon and began to see some of their stuff that Maxwell had plundered. And they became very angry. It said the officers had to hold these people back from murdering the British. They were under a flag of truce at this point in time with the surrender of the fort.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution. Walk in the footsteps of heroes and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are again with Andy Thomas, the curator of the Cayce Historical Museum, and David Brinkman, local historian and archaeologist of the Cayce Historical Museum Commission. So today's episode, we're going to talk about Fort Granby and the Revolutionary War. His history man likes to constantly, we need a niche, that's our niche, the Revolutionary War. Fort Granby is the site of some interesting happenings during the Revolutionary War, and oftentimes they are washed away with history. So love to hear from y'all and about that history, and I'm going to sit back and let y'all tell me about it.
Well, I think first of all, we want to talk about the establishment of a trading post here in 1765 by Kershaw and Chestnut, who were merchants and businessmen from Camden, and they built a trading post over here as well. They also had a trading post in Camden. I think Kershaw is where they also had another one, kind of like the Walmarts of their day, I guess. This trading post was located on the river, the Congaree River. There was a ferry near the trading post, so you could facilitate trade from the east to the west side of the river. There was the old Cherokee path that passed by the trading post. By that time, it was the old state road. That state road went from the coast to the mountains of South Carolina. And there was also an east-west road that crossed here from Camden to Augusta. So this trading post occupied an important strategic location in the backcountry of South Carolina. And so, of course, we know that the Revolutionary War breaks out in New England, and for the first part of the war, New England and the middle Atlantic states are where all the action takes place and in the theater of war and whatnot. And then, of course, the British come up with a new strategy, and they decide that they're going to take the South, and hopefully if they can take the South, they can then move up and take the rest of America. And of course they take Savannah, Georgia in 1779, and then in 1780 Charleston falls to the British. And with the fall of Charleston, the British spread out into the South Carolina backcountry, and the British began to build and construct forts and outposts that will facilitate their communication lines, will also facilitate their provisioning lines. And so one of the places that they see as strategically important is this trading post here at the Congarees. And so they ride up one day, the owners are there, and they tell them that this is now this is theirs now. And the British kick the owners out, or the people, running the trading post for Mr. Kershaw and Mr. Chestnut. They proceed to build a palisade wall around the trading post. They also put a powder magazine in there. I think they create an arborist around the site, and they proceed to call this Fort Granby. Now, why Granby? Well, Granby was the name of a British hero who had fought in Europe during what we call the French and Indian War, but what Europeans call the 7 Years' War. They chose this British hero to name this post that they put here in South Carolina.
He was the Marquis of Granby, was his title.
I see.
Which is really nothing, but he was different. He was a true hero and very well loved, and you see different places in the colony that took on the name Granby because of him.
It looks like the British are going to overwhelm South Carolina. As we know, if you follow the history of South Carolina, the revolution in South Carolina, things seem to be going well from the British, especially with the Battle of Camden and the debacle there with Gates and whatnot. But As we get towards the end of that year, the Patriots begin to have some victories. Kings Mountain is one of the victories. And then, of course, the following year in January is the Great Battle of Cowpens. And the Patriots and Nathaniel Greene kind of get their footing under themselves again. And Nathaniel Greene is very interested in pushing the British out of South Carolina. And to do that, he wants to take out some of these forts and outposts that the British have established as communication points and as strategic supply points and whatnot. And so Fort Granby becomes of interest, especially to Thomas Sumter, who is waging the war under Nathaniel Greene, or as part of Nathaniel Greene's army. So the rumor gets around in February 1781 that Granby's running low on supplies. This is an opportunity for Thomas Sumter to attack Granby. And so he gathers an army together. They march out. They get to the Congaree. They overwhelm the guards on the ferry and cross the river with this force. And then they begin to surround the fort. But unfortunately, the fort has been tipped off by a spy. And the people in the fort, they know that the Americans are coming. And they begin the assault on the fort. And Sumter's men are pushed back in the first assault.
And that was in May, right?
No, this is still February. This is the first,
February.
Yeah, this is the one under Sumter.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's two battles at Fort Granby. There's the first battle in February, and then there's a follow-up battle in May. So we're talking about the first one.
So when they come here, and I'm going to stop you for just a second. When they come here to the museum, and was this a reconstruction of that particular main building at Fort Granby?
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But this structure would have been closer to the river, right? And it would have been surrounded by trenches and abattis, and it would be a fairly formidable location to try to attack at that point, correct?
Yeah, so there would have been about 350 troops located in and around the fort. Most of those were loyalists.
It's hard to imagine that as you're in this building that you have 300 and something, in this
right
in this area. Even if you're saying, okay, this building was closer to the river, and the fortifications are just hard to imagine that you're able to hold that many people. Same is true at 96 when you go to that Star Fort up there, and they say how many people are actually in that Star Fort, and you're just like, that is just unbelievable to have that many people in there. But anyway, I digress. Go ahead. And so they make one assault and that fails, and then what?
Well, they begin to use tobacco bales to try to move up on the fort, and fire behind the tobacco bales and stuff like that. They're only mildly successful in moving the lines forward and whatnot. And then they also build something called a Mayhem Tower. And the quote is from Sumter, or from one of the people recording the battle. His marksmen mounted upon a temporary structure of rails, but the British refused to yield to Sumter. And Sumter's men began to run out of ammunition in their battle with the British. Now, over in Camden is Lord Francis Rawdon, who is the British commander in this part of the South, and when he learns that Fort Granby is under siege, he dispatches about 600 men and 200 cavalry under a Colonel Wellborn Ellis Doyle, who's with the Volunteers of Ireland. They also have artillery pieces that they are bringing with them. And so I think Sumter's going to realize pretty quickly once his spies and his people tell him what's on the move, that there's going to be a problem here. He's running out of ammunition. There's a relief force on the way, and he's almost going to be caught in a trap unless he figures out a way out of it. And so before Lieutenant Colonel Doyle gets here, Sumter finds his way out of the trap. He recrosses the river. But he does leave men surrounding the fort, especially after the British, they come in, they relieve the fort, maybe a couple of weeks, and then these troops are being transferred elsewhere or whatever. But there's still Sumter's men out there, and they're still interested in taking this fort, so they're still kind of surrounding it during that time period. So there were guerrilla raids that took place over the next couple of months by these.
So Sumter's men never actually, the better part of his army moved away, but he left remnants behind to kind of keep an eye on things and to keep them occupied, so to speak, so that it kind of kept them in check.
Right.
And kept them isolated or at least stagnant, trying to hold on to this fort. Is that what you're telling me?
And what I guess what I didn't talk about was that he supposedly destroyed as many provisions as he could. He burnt the powder magazine, so that, or the powerhouse for the fort. And so there were some things that he did as he was moving out of here, but he realized that he had to retreat, for superior force or whatnot. But the interest is still there to take this fort.
How long would it have taken for Rowland's men to get from Camden to here?
Probably a couple of days, I would imagine. So they would have been well.
He sent a cavalry unit with them as well.
So if they had learned about it, Sumter's approach beforehand through spies and whatnot, they may have actually set off earlier, maybe on the 18th or the 19th or whatever. So, but so they would have been marching hard, to get over here to relieve the fort.
So you said they started with some guerrilla tactics after Sumter's main body left. They kind of hung around the area and just kind of picked off people here and there. Is that what you're saying? Or interdicted on some supply chain stuff? Or what's going on?
Yeah, I think that kind of characterizes that period, trying to just keep the British, in their place or whatever, in the fort or whatever, but there was some guerrilla raids that took place during that period. So General Sumter was still interested in taking Fort Granby, and Sumter had to also deal with his men as far as how much time they served, because men only served for a certain number of time and whatnot. And so Sumter had to provide bonuses to those that decided that they would serve more time. I think it was usually 60 days. So Sumter kind of provided bonuses to get these people to serve more. He also gave slaves to some of the soldiers that would serve longer. So in April of that year, Sumter led about 500 troops south of the Congaree River. They attacked the guards at Friday's Ferry, which is the ferry that went from east to west that we talked about on the river, and they drove those guards off. And this cavalry spread out and took control of Friday's Ferry, so that by May the 2nd, the second siege of Fort Granby was well on its way. And there was a Colonel Thomas Taylor who continued to siege the fort for Sumter during this time period. After they took the ferry, his men actually surrounded the fort in a more organized way than these guerrilla battles that had taken place earlier. Now, in the fort is Andrew Maxwell. He's the commander of the fort for the British, and he's from Maryland. And he is over, like we said, about 350 soldiers. There's also 60 Hessians.
Yeah, about 60 Hessians. Yeah.
Okay.
That are serving, but most of the soldiers are loyalists. They're not drawn from the regular army or whatnot. You got stuff about these Hessians, don't you?
Yeah, so the beginning of all this, when they attacked the ferry site, there were 13 British loyalists that were killed in that action.
Okay.
And then they chased back, I think, another 4 or 5 that were killed trying to get back to the fort. So there was quite a bit of bloodshed at that stage, that first day. Where that occurred at is just a couple hundred feet from the dig site. And we have found a number of musket balls and shots.
Okay.
We can't really date those, but we did find a Hessian button, which is it's a 3-legged eagle with Latin written on it, which I think means "In God We Trust."
Okay.
Something like that.
All right.
So it's a very unique button that the Hessians wore. So one of the questions was, were they a part of this group that was at the ferry.
Or did somebody pick up a Hessian button and put it on their uniform?
Yeah, it could have been. I mean, when they lost the fort, they marched these guys out, and they may have just thrown their uniforms off.
That's right.
But
That's right.
in fact, where we found it is actually in the area where it could be slave quarters.
I see.
In Granby, and who knows? Maybe it was uniforms passed down to the slaves. We may never know that, but
fascinating story.
Yeah.
All right. Taylor is surrounding or starting the siege again, and this is May at this point. Is that correct?
Right. So during that time period, there is a battle taking place over at Fort Mott. And Sumter actually is trying to participate and wants to get over to help with that battle. But when he gets over there, he finds that Fort Mott has already been attacked by Lee and Marion.
We're talking about Light Horse Harry Lee.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, he'll play an important part later.
Okay.
And Francis Marion. And so Sumter turned his troops towards Orangeburg to fight the battle there. During that period, Sumter realized he needed a cannon to take Fort Granby.
Right.
And he had actually approached Nathaniel Greene about it. And Nathaniel Greene had promised him a cannon. And when Sumter took off for Orangeburg, Greene had the cannon for him, but Sumter was nowhere to be found. And so I think Nathaniel Greene was a little bit exasperated with Sumter. And so he then ordered Lee, who is Light Horse Harry Lee, or William Lee III, who would be the future father of Robert E. Lee. He's serving here in South Carolina with Lee's Legion out of Virginia. So he orders Light Horse Harry Lee and his troops, along with Sumter's troops that are surrounding the fort, to take the fort. There's also a report that, once again, spies have reported these actions, these movements or whatnot, and the rumor is that Lord Francis Rawdon is moving out with another large army, to try to protect Fort Granby. This is in May, and Lee begins his attack on May the 15th on the fort.
And Taylor is still here.
Taylor is still here. That's right.
So still some of Sumter's troops are still here.
That's right.
Okay, all right.
So Lee erected a battery on one side of the fort, and it's the next morning, which is the 16th, there's a dense fog over the Congaree. And he's able to push those cannons up to the edge of the river, and they begin the bombardment of Fort Granby.
Now, I'm going to stop you right there. There was a question of, was one of those cannon located across the river over in Richland County? Yes? No, you're nodding your head.
There's a painting that shows that.
There's a painting that shows that. Did that really happen? So, I mean, Richland County...
they try to claim that.
They try to claim it.
Yeah.
So, but we don't know? There's no evidence of that? Or...
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Okay, all right.
I will say that the river was... we have a painting here at the Cayce Museum. It shows it really close up, but it wasn't as close up in the painting. That was kind of artistic license to show it as close as that. But you're probably correct. They were probably set up across the river, to begin this action.
That would be kind of a long shot, though. But,
yeah.
Because it's not really, the fort's not really on the river.
They lobbed 2 cannonballs into the fort, and then Lee's legionaries, they cut off the pickets that were surrounding the fort, and then Lee was ready for stage 2 of the siege. And at that point, he offered the commander of the fort, Andrew Maxwell, an opportunity to surrender. Now, let's talk about Andrew Maxwell, because he wasn't really a fighter. Andrew Maxwell, like I said, he was from Maryland. He was a loyal British subject. He'd been assigned this post. He'd been given the command there. But he didn't really want to have a fight. He was a plunderer. He had been plundering things from around the area for a long, long time. Included furniture, silverware, slaves, animals off farms, you name it. It wasn't nailed down. He was going to take it.
He wasn't interested in winning the hearts and minds of the people.
Right. So he had developed a big loot of materials, at Fort Granby. He walked out and had a discussion with Lee. Lee, I think, is kind of thinking in the back of his head, too, is Lord Rawdon on the way? Does he have a larger force? That kind of stuff. And so what he hears from Maxwell is kind of, it's very tempting, and he pretty much tempts Lee to accept a deal with him. And that deal is going to be, hey, if you'll let me take some of my stuff out of here, then I'm going to, surrender Fort Granby to you. Basically, that's what happens. Maxwell packs up a wagon full of materials that he's looted and taken from the countryside, and they begin to make their way out of the fort. As they're making their way out of the fort, the story goes that Sumter's men looked into the wagon and began to see some of their stuff that Maxwell had plundered, and they became very angry. It said the officers had to hold these people back from murdering the British. They were under a flag of truce at this point in time with the surrender of the fort.
I bet so. It was a slap in their face here. They're not serving under Lee. Lee is a Virginian, right? Lee has made this compact with Maxwell, who's not even from this area either. He's from Maryland.
Right.
And Sumter's men are all from South Carolina, and they're seeing everything taken from them, right? And and they're fighting for their very homes, and many of these men, their homes were burned by the British to begin with. So, interesting.
What happens is the men get angry. The officers try to hold him back. This gets back, of course, to Sumter. Sumter, at some point, threatens to resign because of this tapestry has happened to his men and his command or whatever. Nathaniel Greene talks him out of it, thank goodness. The story goes that Lee decided it was a little hot in South Carolina for him, and maybe he should go fight some battles over in Georgia. And I think he ended up fighting some battles over in Augusta to kind of get out of the Midlands of South Carolina. Now, I will tell you that we do know what happened when Lee took the fort. I just want to kind of give you an idea of what was captured, because they did write up a report. There was 8,028 musket cartridges, 192 muskets, 86 bayonets, 100 carriage boxes, 63 rifles, 3,000 flints, 120 pounds of powder, 20 12-pounder canister shot, 1 drum, 3 2-pound cannonades, 2 5.5-inch Hausers. And so these were the type of materials that the British had been moving around to their armies in the backcountry, and these were provisioned, and they were there at the fort. So this was a blow to the British, as every fall of every fort in the backcountry was to the British at this point in time. But Sumter actually tried to make up for some of this with his men by distributing livestock and slaves for some of the loot that Maxwell had taken with him. And it's kind of interesting because this was a structure that it did change hands twice more, because it wasn't really occupied with a large force. I mean, there's other battles taking place. The Americans are really trying hard to push the British out of South Carolina, and there's these other battles that are taking place out there. We've got 2 more stories connected with our museum and the Revolutionary War. One of the stories is about the Lord Cornwallis table. It's a table we have here at the museum. It's on loan from McKissick Museum. Supposedly it was Lord Cornwallis's table. An American soldier found it, and he brought it back to this area. And then through marriage, it ended up with the Cayce family. And we actually have a photograph from 1898 showing where the family placed a table outside of the house, because they were so proud they had Lord Cornwallis's table. Now, there's no way we can say it was really Lord Cornwallis's table or not. And there's a lot of stories about it. There's a story that it was found at the Lord Cornwallis's field camp at Camden.
We're not talking about an ornate, huge dining room table, are we?
We're talking about a small tea table, is what we're talking about.
Right. Something that could be put in the back of a wagon and moved from camp to camp,
that's
or
right,
post to post. Okay.
So that's one of the stories. Obviously, that story kind of doesn't fit the facts of history. Another story was that Lord Cornwallis was out playing cards on his table, and Americans were sneaking up on him, and when he realized it, he just ran away. And of course, the Americans lifted the table, at that point.
Okay.
Most likely story would be Cornwallis cannot catch Nathaniel Greene. He just seems to be moving very fast with his army. Cornwallis is kind of weighed down with this baggage train he has. He's fighting a European-style war in the American backcountry. European-style war may mean that in Europe, when you're fighting your battles with the French, you might set up a nice ornate tent and lay it out, just as fine as anything a nobleman, could dine with. And, so he had tables and he had silverware and he had this tent, and, all the stuff that the nobility would have taken with them in these battles in Europe. South Carolina backcountry, that just is not, you're not going to be sitting down to dine with most of your enemy here. And so Cornwallis decided to be able to catch Greene. He's going to dump a lot of his baggage and burn a lot of his baggage. And so it may have been that this table actually was a piece of that furniture that didn't get burnt, but was taken back.
Is there any indication that it came from somewhere other than South Carolina? I mean, was it made in Britain, England? Was it made in a European country, or do we know?
We don't know. We do know that the style and the decade it was made was the period of the American Revolution. So that's what we do know about
Very
it.
good. All right. What else?
About the third story, it's about a famous spy, a woman spy here in Cayce.
Excited. Here we go.
So the story goes that Nathaniel Greene needed to get a message delivered to Thomas Sumter. And to do that, there's probably about 70 miles of British occupied territory between Greene and Sumter. This is in the time period after the fall of 96. Lord Rawdon has actually marched back from the relief of 96, and he has reoccupied Fort Granby. He's coming through here. But he knows right on his heels is Nathaniel Greene. And so this is the time period when this story supposedly took place, July 2nd, 3rd, 4th of 1781. So Nathaniel Greene, he realizes that if he sends a man, that immediately they will probably be apprehended, stopped, searched, whatever, with this message. So he's looking for someone else to carry it. And a young lady steps forward, and the story... so it kind of has developed these mythologies and whatnot, but supposedly in the story, Emily's father was an invalid and could not serve in the Revolution, but she told him that, my family is just as proud as anybody else's family, and, we want to show that we're just as patriotic, and I'd be glad to do this, this task or whatever. Of course, Greene is kind of apprehensive about that.
She's got some moxie.
That's right. Greene is kind of apprehensive about that, but nevertheless, he writes out his message, folds it, seals it, that kind of stuff. Emily puts it in her pocket or her petticoat, but she sets off by horseback. And the first night, because a spy had been at Greene's camp, it gets communicated to this family that Emily stops to spend the night with on her horseback drive to get to Sumter. And supposedly the spy comes up and talks to the family, and the family are loyalists, and they understand what's going on, and they're going to capture Emily in the morning. But somehow Emily intuitively knows that this family is not meaning very well to her, even though they've invited her to spend the night. So she slips out, before dawn, and she's on the road. So she, this first night, she kind of avoids the danger of being captured. But it is on the second night that she is captured. She's a young woman. She's out at night. She's on a horse. She's galloping in the woods, and British soldiers are going to stop her. They take her supposedly back to Fort Granby. They take her upstairs to Lord Rawdon's room, which he's using as his field office. And the story goes that Lord Rawdon said, I think you're a spy, but I'm too much of a British gentleman to search you, so I'm going to send for my serving lady. And he locked her in the room, supposedly. Emily had to figure out a way to get out of this because she knew that the message is contraband. So she takes the message out, opens it, breaks the seal, reads it, memorizes it as best she can, rips it up into shreds, And to get rid of the evidence, she puts it in her mouth, she chews it, and she swallows it, and down it goes. And so she eats the message, and the serving lady comes up. They can find nothing on Emily. So Rawdon allows Emily to carry on with her travels. He's still suspicious of her, so his men escort her to a friend's house. Emily, as soon as the British are gone, she's back on the horse, galloping as hard as she can to Sumter's camp. Supposedly the next day she arrives at Sumter's camp and she delivers the message verbally, to General Sumter. Everybody says, that makes her a true heroine of the American Revolution. Now, there are some controversies around this whole story. First of all, the story was first recorded in the 1840s by a lady named Ellett. And Ellett was writing a book, Women of the American Revolution, 1848. This book comes out. There's one or two short paragraphs about Emily's story in there. And it doesn't talk about her having the first night where she's staying with the family or whatever. But there's a lot of oral history about Emily in this area. There's really no documents that we know that you point to that tell this story contemporary, from that contemporary time period. And so the question is, did Emily exist? I'm going to let David kind of delve into some of that too.
Well, where I got involved in this, John Howell, who was a local historian and had genealogy to Emily Giger. Now, at one point, the South Carolina historian A.S. Sally actually published something stating that he didn't think she ever existed. But I think there's enough evidence out there that she did. I think that's been kind of discounted now. So we believe she did exist. John Howell, over his life, he passed away just within a year or two ago. But we did a little we actually came into the museum and filmed a little presentation on all the things he knew about Emily. And John had been involved in locating her grave because nobody really knew where that was. Now, we do know that she married a man named Three-Wits. And there's an old historic house. We're actually trying to hope that somebody can save it. It was the Three-Wits house where she supposedly lived. And the story is that she probably died from complications of childbirth. There's some accounts that she made visits to Granby. She had relatives in Granby, and she would go there and tell the story about what happened. But so she died fairly young. We didn't know where her gravesite was, but John uncovered an article that was in the state newspaper. It was about the year 1900, I think, of a member of the Three-Wits family, and he was a medical doctor. He was getting up there in the years. He was probably 80 or 90 at the time, and he documented in this story where Emily Giger was buried on their property, and he gave it relative to another specific grave, which is there today. There's
okay.
the one relative to that position. There was nothing there. John went out. They did some things. Do you have the? What is it?
They're upstairs. The dowsing rod.
The dowsing rods. Yeah, he actually used that and found what he thought were two graves. So John and some others hired some GPR experts, and they came out and. Sure enough, right at that spot, they found an adult grave and a child's grave right next to it. So at that point, they decided to mark the grave. We can't dig them up and do DNA on it, but they just marked the grave as that being hers. So that's how I kind of got brought into it. The thing that disturbs me a little bit about it is the difficulty in the genealogy that we have. We don't really know who her parents were. Several people claim that they're related to her, and you get into the genealogy and it's very confusing. So it's kind of strange. I was telling Andy that this morning. Isn't it strange that somebody that would have been well known or famous, that it seems like everybody would be claiming to be her relative, from that
right.
period on, and
right.
something like that just would not have been lost so easily. It's a great story, and there are, I think she definitely did exist.
But it's one of those stories that you have so much information that you're like, if there's not some truth to it, that's a heck of a story to make up.
Yeah.
If there's not some sort of truth to it. I mean, for you to say, oh yeah, she got, the story is she got locked away upstairs till they could find, someone to search her. That sounds like something that would actually happen, right?
Yeah, with the British.
Interesting.
I believe that she could have existed, and I think there's no proof that she did or didn't. But in a larger way, I think the fact that you're talking about women and you're talking about the American Revolution and you're talking about how women contributed to the Patriot effort to win the American Revolution, she's almost like an archetype. Emily represents that for this area.
And it was right in that momentum change that just turned everything around, right? And ended the revolution, right?
Wow.
And it's a fantastic story. I mean, it really does. It has its twists and turns and that kind of stuff. And I think they called Emily somebody had written the Paul Revere of South Carolina in some way. I mean, so...
What a great story. Tell our listeners a little bit, again, what they would find here at the museum and maybe some events that are coming up and how they can reach you, that sort of thing.
Okay, so Cayce Museum is a great value if you haven't ever been by to see us. We're open Tuesday through Friday from 9 to 5 and on Saturdays and Sundays from 2 to 5. And our prices on the other days are very reasonable. $3 adults, $2 senior, $2 for people with military ID, $1 for children under 12. On Sunday afternoons, we're free. So that makes it really good. We have 4 rooms here in the museum. We have a room that has a tremendous collection of Native American objects that were donated to our museum, 5,000 to 6,000 pieces. We have objects going back to Clovis points, which are some of the earliest, all the way through the historic period. We have a lot of objects from South Carolina, but we also have objects from all over the country. We have a lot of history that we tell here about the colonial period, obviously, because we had such a long colonial period here in Cayce. We have some objects that tell that 19th century period and then 20th and 21st century. So we're very diverse, the different things you're going to find here at the museum. You can look at our social media account. We do have special lectures and things that we're doing. But we've got a big event coming up on April the 1st in conjunction with Tartan Day South, which is a big Celtic festival here in the Columbia area. Tartan Day South goes for several days, but the main day is Saturday, April the 1st, and they open their gates at 9. You would have to pay, to get in admission-wise. You can check out their website. I would just Google Tartan Day South. It'll come up and give you a schedule and, what's going on. But at that event, we're going to have something called the Colonial Village. The Colonial Village is going to be a group of experts talking about the story of the colonial period and revolution in the Midlands. David's going to be there. He'll have objects that he's dug up in Granby and from the fort, Congaree 2. I've got a lady that's going to be weaving. We've got a guy that's making the rifles from wood. I've got a blacksmith. I've got a brick maker. I've got just various craftsmen and artisans doing these traditional crafts, candle maker, things that you would have seen during the colonial times. And some of these will be hands-on for children. And so that makes that a really nice way to kind of be introduced to, how they're living, how they're accomplishing these things, whether it's making brick or weaving a piece of cloth or dyeing a piece of cloth. We've got a textile dyer that's going to be there too. So that's a real exciting event we're looking forward to on April the 1st here with the museum.
Outstanding. Well, thank y'all so much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.